Hello, good morning, class. As usual, my name is Deborah Adu-Twumwaah, your business law facilitator, and I have decided to put together this video for my MBA students to be able to watch and then understand the nature of contracts. As you know, you can repeat this video as many times as you want in order to get the concept well explained, but if you go to the LMS, we have the lecture materials plus the other, documents that will help you get full understanding of every concept that I will raise here. If you have further questions too, you can send me a message on the LMS or through my mail, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Yeah, so the last time we looked at the nature of law, and today we are going to consider the nature of contracts and test of agreements. The nature of contract and test of agreement. You and I, or you would agree with me that when it comes to contracts or agreement, it is part of our day-to-day activities, especially those of us in business. On daily basis, we enter into agreements with people, or people enter into agreements with us, and there are a lot of legal implications which we may not be aware. So this class is going to enlighten us to be able to understand the agreements or the contracts we enter into and the legal implications that come with it. In the first place, how do we determine that a particular agreement between, for instance, us and our business partners, our customers, our suppliers, etc., are valid agreements or are binding on us by law? There are certain factors that needs to be present before we can say that a particular agreement is a contract or is a legal binding agreement. So before we move into the nature of contracts, I would like us to consider or look at how the court of competent jurisdiction is able to determine that there has been an agreement between two or more parties. Now, if you look at our laws, or if you look at the nature of agreement before, the court was going by what we call the consensus ad idem. Consensus ad idem, meaning that it simply means meeting of the minds. That is, the court was, before the court determined that there was an agreement between two or more parties, it looked at how the two parties' minds met, as in whether they were having the same mindset or mental status when they were entering into a particular agreement, which also meant that if two people entered into an agreement and they didn't have the same mindset, then the courts determined or ruled in those days that there was no valid agreement between them. But this particular, yardstick created a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties. So the court at a point in time had to drop that and to go with the objective test. The objective test, which is also known as the reasonable man's theory. That is the ordinary bystander. Now, if we talk about the reasonable man's theory in law, we are simply looking at a situation whereby if there is any misunderstanding between two parties who have entered into an agreement, then the court will simply call a neutral person to give his opinion, and the court will apply the understanding of that neutral question in coming up with its final determination on the matter. Now, if you read the case of Freeman versus Cooks, and Raffles versus Rachel Hall, the courts really made this objective test, use the objective test in determining its final judgment. Now, let's look at some details of the case of Raphaels versus Rachel Halls. I'll urge all of you to go and get the full details of the case to read. I'll just give you a summary of what happened in that case. Now, in this case, that's the case of Raphaels versus Rachel Halls. The plaintiff agreed to sell to the defendants 125 bales of thread cotton, which was to arrive via a ship called Peerless from Bombay. Now, the defendants believed the shipment would arrive on the PLS that arrived from Bombay in October. You see, the defendants actually believed that the shipment would arrive on the PLS that arrived from Bombay in October. However, the plaintiff was unaware of such a ship. You see, the plaintiff did not know PLS even arrived in October from Bombay. The plaintiff was aware of the PLS that arrived from Bombay in December. So when the when the December PLS arrived, when the October PLS arrived, and then there was no such bale of surret cotton as agreed by the plaintiff and then the defendants simply went ahead to acquire a new, set of cotton for his factory. And then lo and behold, in December, the PLS arrived with the cotton, and the plaintiff was ready and willing to deliver the cotton to the defendant, but the defendant refused to accept the cotton or pay the plaintiff for it, because according to the defendant, he waited in October. We agreed that you send the cotton through PLS, and he was aware that PLS arrived from Bombay in October, but when that PLS arrived, there was no such cotton, so he went ahead to buy a new cotton. And here is the case. The plaintiff also, was willing to deliver the cotton with the December PLS. So you can see clearly that here there was no meeting of the minds. The two people had different mindsets altogether. So the court applied the objective test, because I've already told you that the consensus ad idem is no longer the case. That's the court no longer go by the consensus as ad idem, because it is not for the court to determine the meeting of people's minds, and there are a whole lot of challenges that surrounded that particular yardstick. And so the court applied the objective test and stated that a reasonable person would not have been able to state with certainty which sailing had been agreed. You see, the court applied the reasonable man's theory. So the court called upon a mere bystander who did not understand, or who at that point, when you tell me that I will send the cotton via PLS, and the two of us, because I was thinking PLS arrived in October, and you were also thinking PLS arrived in December. I mean, it is quite impossible for any two people entering into a valid agreement to, have the same mindset. So the court simply applied the objective test and said that it is quite difficult or impossible for anybody to have understood a particular type of ship that was going to carry the cotton. So the contract was therefore declared as void. Okay, so having looked at how the courts determine the nature of agreements, that is using the objective test, which is the current test the court goes by. Now we are going to look at the formation of contracts. Formation of contract. How is a contract formed? How is a contract formed? You know, how can we determine that a particular agreement is a valid agreement or it is not a valid or binding agreement on the parties involved? In determining whether a particular agreement is a valid or binding agreement, there are some key elements that needs to be present. There are some key elements that needs to be present, and we are going to go through all these key elements. Now, we will look at the first element, which is offer. We will consider the second, which is acceptance. We will look at consideration. We will look at intention to create legal relations. We will look at the capacity, and we will also consider the fact that for a valid or for an agreement to be considered as a valid agreement, there should be no vitiating factors. So we will look at vitiating factors. Okay, to begin with, we move on straight to offer. Offer. What do we mean by an offer? What do we mean by an offer? Now, if we talk about offer in law, offer is simply an expression of willingness by one party to contract on certain terms with the intention that it shall be binding as soon as it is accepted by the offeree. That is the willingness of one party involved in an agreement or in a contract, the willingness of one party to contract on certain terms with the intention, very, very important, with the intention that as soon as the offer is accepted by the offeree, it will become binding on the both parties. That is an offer. So this means that you cannot make an offer when you have not intended for the offer to be binding on the parties involved. Two people cannot, or an agreement cannot be deemed as valid when there is no offer. So the first thing, the first key element that needs to be present in a valid agreement is offer. And offer, as we have just seen, simply means the willingness of one party involved in an agreement to contract on certain terms with the full intention that that particular agreement will be binding on the both parties as soon as the offer is accepted by the offeree. If you read the case of NTHC versus NG, I will let you to go and look for the full details of the case to read. In this particular case, the court defined an offer as an indication in words or by conduct, or an indication in words or by conduct by an offeror that he or she is prepared to be bound by a contract in the terms expressed in the offer if the offeree communicates to the offeror his or her acceptance of those terms. Now, one thing I like about this definition is the fact that it is making us know that an offer is not simply a written agreement. The fact that an offer can also be by, it can be by indication of words or by conduct. So we can have an offer being made orally or an offer being written. An offer being made orally or an offer being written. So two parties can, one party, that is the offeror, the one making the offer is known as the offeror. So the offeror can write an offer down, and then the offeree will read and accept the offer. Or the offeror can make an oral offer, and then the offeree may listen and then accept. So an offer can be oral or an offer can be written. Now, in most cases, we have situations whereby there are certain things that happen in our day-to-day life which may seem like an offer, but which in law are not offers. What I'm talking about here is invitation to trade. I want us to distinguish a valid offer from invitation to trade. Now, when we talk about invitation to trade, we are simply referring to an attempt to initiate a bargaining process by soliciting or attracting offers from the party to whom it is addressed. So, invitation to trade is simply an attempt to solicit offers from the party to whom it is addressed, sorry. So when I make invitation or when I initiate a bargaining process, then it means that I want people to make me an offer. The bargaining process I have initiated cannot be deemed as an offer. So an invitation to treat is not an offer. It cannot amount to a valid offer. Now, if you read the case of um, Harvey versus Fassy, and then even in Gibson versus Manchester, the words may be prepared to sell, which was used by the parties, by one party, was held by the court as a notification of price, which is an invitation to trade. Now, there are these two cases that we will come back to as we move on. That's the case of Spencer versus Harding, and then Harrison versus Nickerson. Before we come to the details of the case, and even those cases fall under some of the examples of invitation to treat I'm going to give you. So when we get there, we will come back to those cases or to look at the details of the cases. Now, I want us to look at some examples of invitation to trade, some things or some situations which in our daily life we may think are invitation are offers, but then in law they are simply a bargaining or initiating of a bargaining process, which is invitation to trade. The first one is tender notices. Tender notices, we see tender notices all the time. The Daily Graphic or the other dailies may publish tender notices. The big question is, when you see a tender notice, is the tender notice an offer? Now, the principle is that all notices stating goods are sold at tender are examples of invitation to trade. All notices stating goods are sold at tender are examples of invitation to trade. So if you read a tender notice from the dailies, you cannot go to the particular place to make a bid and expect them to accept your offer immediately. It is when you make the bid that you have offered to them. So it will be up to them to accept. Now, if we look at the case of Spencer versus Harding, Spencer versus Harding, which is a clear example of tender notices not considered as offers. Now, in the case of Spencer versus Harding, the defendant advertised a sale by tender of the stock in trade belonging to Elbeck Company. The advertisement specified where the goods could be viewed, the time of opening for the tender, and the fact that the goods must be paid for in cash. No reserve was stated. The claimant, that's the plaintiff, submitted the highest tender, but the defendant refused to sell the goods to him. The court held that unless the advertisement specified that the highest tender would be accepted, where the highest tender will be accepted, there was no obligation to sell to the person submitting the highest tender. The advert amounted to an invitation to trade. The tender was not an offer. The defendant could choose whether or not to accept the tender. The tender notice was not an offer, but the tender made by the plaintiff was an offer, and it was up to the defendant to choose whether to accept or not. So in this case, this guy read the tender notice from the dailies, and then in the notice it was stated that the goods will be viewed at a particular place, and this guy went there to look at the goods and then made the highest bid. But then the defendant refused selling to him, and he thought that if you have advertised that we should come and view and buy the goods, you made an offer to me which I have come to accept by making the highest bid. So why is it that you didn't sell to me, you rather sold to someone else? He didn't understand. So he took the defendant to court, and in court, the court held that the tender notice was not an offer, it was a mere invitation to trade. It was when he came to make a tender that tender he made became an offer. It was then up to the defendant to either accept or refuse. So there was no valid agreement between the defendant and the plaintiff. So this is a clear example of a case where a tender notice is not an offer. It is a mere invitation to trade. Then another example of invitation to trade is display of goods in a shop window with price attached. In most cases, we visit malls, supermarkets, etc. We see price tags on products, we pick, and then we expect that when we get to the counter to make payments, the amount stated on the goods should be the price we should pay for. My brothers and sisters, the price you see on the goods are mere invitation to trade. They are not offers. It is when you pick the goods and you get to the counter or whoever, the cashier, you get there, then you are making an offer to buy the good at the price stated on it. It is up to the owner of the shop or the cashier to accept by collecting your money and issuing you with a receipt. If you get there, the person may say that, I'm sorry, we have changed our price. We have reviewed our prices, so the amount you saw on it is not the final price. In most cases, you see people, it happens all the time. People pick up products, they get to the counter to pay, and then they are told that the price is not the actual price. They've reviewed their prices, and so he or she is supposed to be paid. He or she is supposed to pay a different price. And you see people going, all over complaining, I'm going to sue you. You guys, you think you can just put anything there, and then when we get here, you say a different thing. You've breached your part of the agreement. There's no offer. There's no offer. The price, the display of the goods with the price attached, that price is not an offer. That price is just an invitation to trade. You will pick up the product, go to the counter, and then you make an offer to whoever is there. Now, the principle with regards to the display of goods in shop window with price attached is that they are just mere invitation to treat. Mere invitation to treat. So the display of goods in shelves with prices attached is not an offer binding the shopkeeper to sell an item. It is only an invitation to treat. The customer, by picking the item with the interest to buy, makes an offer to the shopkeeper, which he or she accepts before it becomes a contract. Now, if you read the case of Fisher versus Bell, in this case, what happened was that a shopkeeper displayed a knife on his shop window with the tickets behind the knife stating ejector knife 4S. You know, he displayed this knife with an inscription at the back on a piece of paper. That is at the back of the knife on a piece of paper that injector knife 4S. Now, someone sued him for selling a weapon which is considered as, for selling a knife which is considered as a weapon and which was contrary to the sale to the Offensive Weapons Act. So he was sued for selling a weapon which was contrary to the Offensive Weapons Act. This is an English case. Now, the courts held that the display of the knife is only an invitation to trade. The court held that by the mere display of the knife on the shop window does not mean the person has made an offer to anybody. The one who picked the knife and went to make payment, if the owner of the shop had accepted the money, then there would have been a contract in acceptance. Then you can charge him for offering for sale or selling a weapon which is contrary to the Offensive Weapons Act. Now, you can also read a case of Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain versus Bud Cash Chemist Limited. This is actually the case where the principle that we are dealing with emerged. The principle that the display of goods is a mere invitation to trade was enunciated in this particular case. So read this case. It is a very popular case. It's about a pharmacy shop which displayed some goods which are supposed to be sold under a pharmacist, and they were sued for selling drugs which were supposed to be sold strictly under the supervision of a pharmacist. But then the court held that the display of the drugs did not amount to an offer. It was a mere invitation to trade. So you can get the full details of the case and then you can read that. Now, let's look at another example of invitation to trade.